It's really nice to be invited here, and I think this is it's an amazing place, and it's an amazing place to kind of share, I guess, my thoughts or my work and try to, engage in discussion. I think there's a lot to be said about even thinking past, I guess, our kind of human-centered worlds, and to even try to wrap our heads around the notion of what it might be to act or enact things in a more than human world. I wanted to do something, the remote doesn't. No, it's not letting me. There we go. I'll do it this way. So I wanted to start close to home. This actually is that's my porch in my back of my house. And it's actually we had a great summer. I live in Vancouver when I'm not elsewhere. And this is, we had a really wonderful summer, and I actually like to go and work right here in this, on my porch, sitting in one of those chairs. And I like to write. It's really a place where I like to do that. And right next to what you can't see on that picture are all of these herbs that I planted. We have like mint, thyme, and oregano. And actually we planted oregano this summer, and it grew like crazy. It was absolutely amazing. And the oregano flowered because it was such a warm summer. It flowered almost right away. And so I'd be sitting in my chair next to oregano that was flowering, and bumblebees, which this is a picture of, they love oregano. And other bees do too. Mason bees, sweat bees, drone flies. They really like the pollen and, of course, the nectar. And bumblebees are really noisy. Bumblebees, in fact, as pollinators, they're really good for things like tomatoes and so on, because they're so noisy, they vibrate the pollen loose and the nectar. And that's what makes them really effective as pollinators with certain plants. And so I would sit there and I love this kind of sound and the companionship of bees. And it didn't hurt that at the same time I was actually trying to do design research, I wrote this book, and the book was in many ways ahead of myself, and trying to think about this question of what does it mean to design in a multi-species world. So here are some examples of this. I'm not going to really talk too much about this work, but just say this is work in progress of trying to design something. And in my work, as Oscar had mentioned, I like to work. I'm a design researcher, but I also I like to think philosophically. And in fact, I like to combine the two. I like to design something to ask philosophical questions. They didn't really start out that way, but that's really what I became really interested in. How do we relate to the things we make? It seems like such a dumb question, but boy, you can just keep going with this question. And I do. And in this particular case, we were designing these things which we call Turner boxes, and trying to understand what kind of relationship can we have with not just bees, but pollinator ecologies, the plants, other pollinators. What is, in fact, that relationship? I was talking about it sitting on my back porch, and I'd be writing, and I was actually writing about this project. And I was talking about, here I am, on my back porch, writing with bees. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm not really writing with bees. I mean, the bees don't care about they don't write. And I'm thinking, well, maybe what am I designing then? Am I designing for bees? And that wasn't right. Am I designing alongside bees? What is the question? And so that's sort of this idea of trying to design something to understand what is the relationship with bees. Now, the project is called Turner Boxes because it's really inspired by the work of Charles Henry Turner, who was a biologist. And actually in the 1910s, he was doing this research on bees, and these boxes were boxes that he designed as a biologist, as part of his research. And he was trying to understand bee perception. And actually he got beaten to it by von Frisch, who actually did the discovery about bees able to perceive different colors. Part of the problem for Charles Henry Turner was he was using red boxes, and bees actually don't see on the red. They don't see red. That's just not part of the spectrum. To them, it's not a color they can actually identify. But what he did discover was actually what's known as bisociative learning. That bees, what he'd do is he'd put honey or sugar water in one of these boxes, and then once bees learned that that particular shape had honey or sugar water, they would fly to this shape that was similar to that. So this idea of bisociative learning. Now, as you can see, Charles Henry Turner was African-American. In fact, he was the first African-American to get a PhD from the University of Chicago. And despite that, was unable to get an academic position. He actually did all his work. He was a high school teacher, I think it was in St. Louis. He did all his biological research on the weekends. Now, I mean, that in itself is quite a story, but it's not really the story I want to tell. I want to come back to this idea of, well, what does it mean to have, what kind of relationship could one have with bees? It's clear that in most biologists, Charles Henry Turner included, is really the studying of bees, how bees can kind of further our human knowledge. What more can we understand about nature, and how much more can we then, I guess that sense, be better at being human? This idea of a kind of humanism, this kind of human exceptionalism, that the world is there for us to know. And we know a lot of the challenges and a lot of the problems that that's created. Another similarly kind of human-centered, human exceptionalist position is the idea that we're going to take care of bees, that we are their stewards. We're going to conserve what it is, the habitats for bees. And on its surface, it seems like a good idea. However, we tend to decide what gets conserved and what does not. This is a pollinator garden. And in fact, what ends up happening is many pollinator gardens, people try to grow plants that attract butterflies, because butterflies are actually much more appealing to look at. People want to go walk in a garden which has butterflies, not necessarily bees. They don't want to be stung. The most obvious relationship that we have to things that are not human is extractive. It's transactional, particularly with bees, honeybees in particular. Honeybees are thoroughly domesticated. Honeybees are, in fact, we rely on them completely for our agriculture. They're the ones that pollinate all the things that we grow. Without bees, without honeybees in particular, because they could be kept in hives of 50,000, they could be moved around to all the different farms and places that need to be pollinated. Without them, we actually wouldn't be able to grow the food that we have. But we have this transactional, we over the centuries have domesticated and been extractive when it comes to bees. So for me, the question was, and me sitting there on the back porch, is what other relations might we have? How might we think about not an extractive one, or not one where we're at the top of the pyramid and are thinking about how we can extract knowledge, but how might we cohabit with bees? And of course, in the age of the Anthropocene and in climate change, this very idea of cohabitation is more urgent than it's ever been. Our ability to live in a world and thrive in a world that's interdependent with things, in a more than human world. This phrase, more than human world, was coined by David Abram, who is a phenomenologist. And he actually went to Bali to study magic, because he was also a magician. He was on sabbatical. He goes, oh, I wanted to study magic. And he wanted to understand how the magicians in Bali did their tricks, so to speak. And what he learned was that there was a deep belief in the animism of things, that magic was really part of what came out of it. Was not something that we performed on our own, but one that we conjoined or collaborated with others. He actually went on to think about phenomenology. He's a phenomenologist. A phenomenologist is trying to understand our relationship to the world, a philosophical understanding of our relationship to the world. His understanding and realization that language, place, culture, routine was grounded in place, that different ethnicities, different cultures is very much the very land, more than human world that they come from, determines and shapes who we are. And so this very notion then of to cohabit, that none of us can we're all cohabiting a world that is far more than human. And so, you can kind of rethink, or maybe the necessity, as he asks, is that we rethink the normal image of us. This is the sort of humanist Age of Enlightenment idea of us at the top of the pyramid, that is humans, to one in which we're in a relational, ecological set of relationships, a set of complications in which we're sharing, we're decentered, as many of you may have heard this idea of post-humanism, that decenters what it is to be human, does not necessarily put them at the top, but now the sets of relations that we have to enact in our more than human world. This is something that, or we might be talking about now, and I think that I was certainly influenced by the work of David Abram, and David Abram was really influenced by what he saw as different ethnicities and indigenous cultures. But of course, there's also, when I was writing the book on more than human-centered worlds, influenced by other theories and philosophies of technology, as Oscar had mentioned. But one of them is really this thinking, and be really certain that much of this notion of ecological thinking, much of this notion of more than human worlds preceded these ideas for centuries amongst indigenous epistemologies, indigenous ways of knowing, of which there are great differences. And in the work on decolonizing methodologies, this idea of relationality and decentered is highly political. It's meaningful about what cultures can exist and what cultures have the right and what cultures should be considered that have been overlooked, exploited, and extracted. What was in the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Humanism, peoples that were not considered to be human. So that's also very much of the project, but also the work of not just nature, but philosophies of technology. So Donna Haraway and her notions of cyberfeminism, the ideas of this relationship to this, what she called nature culture, that we have no nature separate of its own, we have no culture separate on its own, but they're interacting and interdependent together. It's not a world of binarisms, but a world that's much more complicated, a world that's much more relational. And other work like Maria Puido Balcasa, who's talked about non-human care, and the work of Rosie Berdati, who's really sort of explored this idea of post-humanism and how this is a kind of an emancipatory, liberatory way of thinking. And the other work of philosophy of technology, Bruno Latour, who sadly recently passed away, but his work on political ecologies, that the fact that we are in, that's not just the politics of humans, but politics include those things that are not human. Politics include things that we might consider to be ecological, that they somehow need to be brought to the table and are part of the discussion, because they shape so much of who we are and what we are. And other work like post-phenomenologists who understand the we're in a world of technicity, that everything in our world is mediated through technology. So all of this, when you think about this more than human world, and I showed you that diagram of that sort of multiplicitous set of relations, is it's a non-binary world. It's a world that has much more complexities to it. And so this, I don't know if anyone's ever seen this image before, that was in The Guardian, and it was actually taken by Nirmal Purja, and Nirmal Purja was he actually climbed, I think it was 8 summits in 1 year, and Nepalese Sherpa, when in fact, much of this, of course, is a whole other story about how other people have been heralded for climbing things like Mount Everest. But anyway, the point here, he took this photo of one of his climbs. This was very late in the day, and this was this traffic jam going up to Mount Everest. It was actually quite a tragic day. Quite a number of people died on this day because the danger of the ascent, of descending down from the mountain. But the point I want to make here is that here in the most remote place of what we might consider natural is one in which is a construction of, it's a human construction. It's a relationship between us, nature, and technology. In many ways, these climbers are actually having as much of a relationship with the technology that they're encased in as they are with the remoteness of the summit of Mount Everest. And so when I'm thinking of more than human worlds is bringing together this ideas of things that are quote unquote natural and things that are technological and what we consider to be human, and understanding the interdependencies between these. So that's what I was really after in writing this book that came out a little over a year ago. And I was thinking about these thoughts in relation to being a designer and wanting to theorize a practice of what I call designing with, and which the prescription, the goal, what is the point of what is good design? Design is one in which we are able to cohabit the more than human world. So there are a number of concepts and theories I try to, it's one thing to kind of describe some of those relations and the conditions, which I will do, but also to give some concepts, as we mentioned, about how we might think about this and wrap our heads around this as designers. So there are 3 concepts that I'm going to get to later in this talk. I just wanted to put them up, and this is a speaking subject, biography, constituency, but there's a little bit of a journey to get there. And this journey is about trying to rethink the set of constructions that we have about how we should be in this world and how we should understand ourselves. And the first of which is relational ontologies, which goes back to this idea that was really part of much feminist thinking, but the notion that something only means something in relation to something else. Nothing is fixed, nothing is absolute. That's why nature and culture and technology are all relational. They mean something only in relation to something else. But it also points out how the things that we make are so important, how much they constitute and shape who we are. All the material arrangements of the chair, of the table, the very setting that we have right now is shaping who we are at this particular moment. There's a kind of interdependency that is dynamic and changes between us and the things we make. This is a running shirt by the fashion tech designer Pauline Van Dongen. She did her PhD together actually with Oscar and me at Eindhoven University of Technology. And this is called Phototrope. And really what it does is it's an illuminated running shirt. And in this sense of interdependency, it is what shapes someone into being a nocturnal runner. That is, one could be seen at night and one can see at night through their interconnection with this thing. It is what Donna Haraway called the cyborg, that we are all already cyborgs. To even put a running shoe on is to be a runner. It shapes this interconnection with things, shapes who we are. It is what Carrie Wolf called prosthetic creature. And it's not just the technology. In a running shirt, the very fabric, the very material is designed to wick away sweat from our bodies we're running to maintain an optimum temperature. The very design and aesthetics of it is to give us a sense of performance, so we feel more athletic than perhaps we actually are, or we're willingness to perform, as well as the digital technology itself that allows us to be a creature at night. It allows us to inhabit the world and act at night. It shouldn't be a surprise because we're one of many prosthetic creatures. That this interaction, this fluidity between nature and things is happening all the time. This is a wonderful research by Sarah Gelbert, biologist, in which she constructed a vending machine for crows that they would have to determine which token, that is the colored piece of paper, and the shape of it, and they could create, which they would with their beaks, then they would release food, and she would change what that was, and they could adapt to that through the prosthetics of paper. But it goes beyond functionality. So if we even think about what it means to be a spiritual being, or what it means to be religious, this device here, this tau-shaped device is by Bill Gaver at the Interaction Research Studio. It was designed, he designed this for cloistered nuns. And what it does, what you can't see at the top is sort of like a ticker tape. And what it does is it scrapes news feeds from the internet. So they're cloistered, they live in the nunnery only, but this allows them to get news feeds from the outside world that they can use for their daily prayers. But this technology actually just reveals all the other technologies and things at work that make this religious or makes these people spiritual. The habit, the clothes that they wear, the architecture, all of these are prosthetics of religion. They're all parts of what it means to be spiritual. So this idea, this intersection with technology, this interdependency goes well beyond functionality. So, I guess, if you're thinking like you're a designer, you think, well, that's pretty good because actually you're fundamentally shaping what it means to be human. But there's another issue that points out that, in fact, our agency is not the only agency at work here when it comes to designing. So the other aspect that I think is really important to this notion of more than human worlds is this idea of shared agencies. It's kind of what David Abram was talking about, was the influence of the land, influence of other animals, of plants to shape and be part of who we are and have agentic effect in our world. Oops, sorry. So this idea, we tend to think when that's at the top of the pyramid that humans are the only ones that are agential actors, or the most important agential actors, when in fact things themselves have agencies. This is a traffic intersection in Netherlands in the town of Bodegraven. It's a prototype, a pilot. Does anyone want to guess what that strip is in the sidewalk? What is that for? Have impaired vision? No. Anyone else? Okay, I guess I'll tell you. It's if you're walking down the street on your mobile phone. So you're walking down the street, and of course, the light, the green or red light is in your line of sight. You don't have to look up from your phone. So you know if you can cross the street or not cross the street. Now, of course, when this was installed, there were so many critics that said, wait a minute, like here we go again, severing us humans from reality, trapping us in our virtual world. Or another thing that keeps us addicted to technologies, and we just can't get out of this technological world. But in the post-human approach, we are in a technological life world. It's the very technicity of the world that we're in. There's the necessity for such a thing. There's a logic by which this kind of mobile phone traffic light would appear. How different is that from the cyborg encased in their car, and they have their traffic light to say whether they can go or not. How different is for that from the person on the bicycle, their prosthetics of the bicycle, and they have their own light and they can cross the street safely. Or even the pedestrian, if you think about the cyborgian relationship of wearing clothes. And that now we have yet again another prosthetic creature, one with a mobile phone. And in some ways, it's the very logic of the traffic intersection itself. The kind of agencies, what I call the trajectory, it only makes sense that now with the ubiquity of mobile phones, as there was the ubiquity of people riding bicycles or cars, that we would need traffic signals for that. But it wasn't as if it's such a brilliant idea. It's almost the logic of the network. The traffic intersection itself had a kind of agency or trajectory that contributed to the design of the traffic light for those people with mobile phones. But we can think of this agency beyond technology or outside of technology to some degree, because we're never outside of technology. This is a portrait by Roger van der Weyden. And it's, this is a Northern Renaissance portrait, so I guess 1700s. And I don't know about you, but you always notice that it's like, why are these paintings so austere? Why are they so black? Why are they so dark? These are people of this is like, he's like the Elon Musk of his era. This is like, there's authority and power and wealth. Why are they not showing that? And the reason, well, the thing is they are. It happens to be that the distinguisher of wealth and power is actually in the black dye of the wool that they're wearing. It's what came to be known as Burgundian black. It's a very, very particular shade of black. In fact, at the time, they had judges who would assess the quality of the black dye to say whether this was truly Burgundian black or it was some poor inferior version or it was some imitation. They would actually make imitation of this Burgundian black. So it was the black itself, the color, that was actually the signifier of wealth and economic standing. Now, the recipe, the formula for Burgundian black was lost or was very challenging because of language, because of culture, because of different things. And there was a research project led out of Utrecht in the Netherlands to kind of recreate, rediscover, reenact a kind of Burgundian black. This is Claudia Youngstra. She's a textile artist, Dutch textile artist. I was lucky enough to visit her studio in Northern Holland, and she was part of this project. And she was trying to determine what would be the recipe that would create Burgundian black. In many ways, I see her as a kind of more than human textile artist, but she doesn't see herself that way. But I say that because outside her studio is her massive garden that she has, where she uses all the things that she grows as part of her dye. She raises her own sheep, actually, for the wool that she uses. She tries to understand exactly where and how they come about and what all the relationships are when it comes to making clothing. And earlier today, we were talking about sourcing. And so for her, sourcing is something that was really important. So in her formula recipe for Burgundian black, it requires this plant here, which is indigo or woad in Europe. You take the leaves, you ferment them for 3 to 4 months. Depending on the weather, you have to water them, a certain kind of frequency. This gives you this kind of deep blue, this kind of indigo. But that's layered over with another color, and you can see that root. And that's the root of the madder plant. At minimum, that root should be 5 to 6 years old. Ideally, it should be 10 to 12 years old. It then should be dried for 2 years. And then it's ground up, and it makes the right color to be added to the indigo to make the Burgundian black. In other words, you cannot make Burgundian black without the cooperation, without the agency of these plants, without the temporality, without the time. There's all this interconnectedness. This is what is known as the agentic capacities, that these plants, the woad plant, the madder plant, have the capacity to affect the world in the way of making Burgundian black. So in some sense, I see them as also designing. And so in that way, to design things is fundamentally to shape our world, but human agency alone is not the only thing that's happening. Human agency is only partial, it's shared, and it's limited. So we have to think now about, yes, design has this impact, but humans alone are not the only ones that are participating or even designing. The last thing in relation to kind of post-humanism that I found valuable was this idea of interpretive stance. If you remember that kind of diagram of that kind of multiple relationships, that nothing is fixed. And one always has to kind of interpret what is going on at any moment. What is the importance of any given relationship? which really points out that the things in this world and almost everything is political. Not in the sense that it runs for elections, but in the sense that it's politics that requires some negotiation. Nothing is just absolutely good. Nothing is absolutely right. Everything has to be situated and negotiated. And so how we interpret really matters, but this comes around to how we manage the negotiations. This is one of my projects, a project of mine. As I said, I like to make things that kind of ask questions, these philosophical questions. Actually, they're pretty stupid questions sometimes. I wanted to know, what is the relationship we have to the most mundane thing? So this is actually, it's a ceramic bowl, it's a fruit bowl. We've designed multiple of these fruit bowls, but these bowls tilt. So every once in a while, maybe 3 to 4 times a day, on their own, they'll just randomly tilt. And the strategy there is one of defamiliarizing. Take something that is so common, something that is so mundane, and make it slightly strange. And when you make it slightly strange, you reveal what's at work for this thing to situate or be in our world. And this also requires this kind of interpretive stance. What does it mean? Why would we still be asking, what is a ceramic bowl? There's an object that we as being humans have designed or been and have been a part of designing for centuries. It's a bowl. Now, we would take these things that we design and we would do field studies with them. We would have people live with them. We're trying to understand what's the actual sort of sense of living with the things that we make. So in this case, we had the ceramic bowls, the tilting bowls, the philosophers live with them for different periods of time, from 6 weeks up to 2 years. And really to get into a discussion about how do we relate to something like a thing that's designed as simple and mundane as the fruit bowl. So on one of our visits, philosophers we live with wanted to show us this. This is what they called their tilting trap, because you don't always see the bowl tilt. Sometimes you actually hear it, and then you're not really sure. So what they did was they put a tin cup in the middle of it, and they leaned this piece of paper. So this idea that if it tilted, they would definitely hear it, or they would know because the paper had knocked over. So this was their tilting trap. They were quite happy about this. We visited them several weeks later, and this came up in our discussion. Politically, think about that politically. That's the way refugees are treated sometimes. The same kind of surveillance with the bowl, the same suspicion exactly. Somehow we went from something as trivial, well, first of all, as mundane as a ceramic bowl, something as trivial as tilting, to now talking about migrants and surveillance. This kind of sense of our interpreting of our, not the bowl itself, but our relationship to it, the kind of liberties that we give ourselves in relation to things that we think have less rights than us or are less than us, and our willingness to simply surveil. Not that this is, of course, it's quite a stretch to go from a bowl to the real challenges of refugees and migrants, but yet this was part of the interpretive world that things exist in. And in many ways, when you think about this in our more than human world, this is something that we're quite happy to do, which is to surveil the more than human world. This is actually the Tundragram. This actually came out in a wonderful paper by Livio and Devendorf on the eco-technical interface, our ability to instrumentalize the natural world, to understand what this goes back to ideas of stewardship. So our ability and our willingness to surveil and try to understand, and in some sense manage, this is a kind of relationship that we are in, and it's a question of whether now it's a political question, whether we want to continue to do it. But going back to this notion that things are political, even things that are really quite mundane. So here we have these public benches. They're photographs taken by Robert Rosenberger, who's a philosopher. And when we look at these, we think about how these are kind of amenities to our public space. It's the kind of things that add to our public space. And we think, no, they have armrests. We think, wow, that's quite, that's a nice addition to the bench. But wait a minute, do we really need armrests on a public bench? That there are actually ways in which we might interpret what that bench is about, depending on what our position is. To most of us, we'd look and go, oh, that's quite an inviting addition to public space. But to those who are unhoused and those who are homeless, the very point of the armrest on the bench is to prevent somebody from sleeping on that bench. It actually takes a public space and makes it exclusionary. And through design, it fixes a certain kind of interpretation, not just of the bench, but of public spaces. This is what Robert Rosenberger went on to call callous objects. But this just points out the very politics of the things that we design, the ways in which they shape, because they're so fundamentally shape us. They have their own agentic capacities that they have these effects. And here they're used in a political way to determine what is public space. But this also comes back to what Bruno Latour talked about, where all things have politics. Politics attach themselves to things. Okay. So I talked about a lot of stuff. So let me kind of just quickly summarize, then get on to the concepts that I was talking about. The first thing is that things are fundamental. So that means that things are a part of us, this idea that we are prosthetic creatures. So really this notion that we need to design for interaction is kind of really interesting when in fact we are so willing and needing and necessitate this idea of having this deep relationship to things. Things are transformative in the sense that things themselves design, like the traffic light, like the indigo and matter plant. And things are interpreted, which means that things are political. So in a way, when we come back and thinking about this post-human or more than human world, we're in a different configuration of what and how we cohabit that world. And what is the way in which our things participate in that world. And so the question really becomes, well, how does one act with that? How does one rethink some of the assumptions that I think we've had in design that I think seriously, this is what I'm trying to offer in this book, is ways to rethink that. So the first of which is what I call speaking subject. It's an odd term. In some ways, it's a really ambivalent term. The idea of speaking subject is if we as humans are not the only agential actor in designing, that a designer is made up of humans and non-humans, things also participate in that designing, then what is our role? And our role is to kind of work and participate with other non-humans in the ways in which we design, but we also have this one particular role of being one who speaks language, human language, that we are the speaking subject. We speak on behalf of things. This comes from Bruno Latour, who talked about scientists who speak on behalf of non-human things. He did an ethnography of soil scientists and how they would eat the soil, taste the soil, how they would look at the particular color, how they would put it through pH tests, that these are all these kinds of translations of trying to speak on behalf of soil. And in many ways, I think we as designers do the same thing. We speak on behalf of the things that are participating us in the way we design. But we're also responsible for gathering those things. We might come up with the idea that we're going to design something and we gather these things. So we gather things in this kind of dynamic relational world. So when I think about designing or how one designs and designing with, I think a good metaphor is like flying a kite. So if I think I'm the speaking subject and I decide I'm going to fly a kite today, I gather what I need to fly a kite. Maybe the shoes I'm going to wear, the clothing I'm going to wear, the kite itself. I find the place where I might run and then let the kite into the air and it'll start to fly. But once that kite is in the air, I may have originated, but I am not guiding. I am not one that's completely in control of the flight path that it takes. It's interdependent with the tension on the string and the string that I'm using, the shape of the kite and the material, the wind, the air pressure, the temperature, those people around me, the very landscape. These are all conspiring together or cooperating together or competing together to fly this kite. And it's this that I think that we actually do when we design, that we need to understand and work with, design with, in relation to things that are not human when we design. So in many ways, when I go back to this thinking through about how I'm trying to design for bees, it's really about trying to think about inserting this thing that I design to try to design with and try to translate in a way that's also very ambiguous and very ambivalent, but not just the thing I design, but it relates to the whole pollination ecology that it's a part of, the plants, the place, the other pollinators, that it's all part of that assembly or assemblage. The second term is this idea of biography. So I think biography is something that we can think about, in the most classic sense that everyone has their own biography. But I wanted to think about biographies in a more than human sense, a more than human world. So biography is made up of two words, bio or bios. If I think about designers as being both human and non-human, so the life force of humans and non-humans together, the agency that's combined, that's the kind of bios. Graphy is to write. So what we together inscribe into the world when something is made, what that thing inscribes in the world. And all biographies end. So what's left behind when we design something? And in a way, this kind of leaving behind is actually more important, I think, right now, in the sense that we always tend to think as designers of just the beginnings of what is it new that we're going to bring into the world. We rarely think about what that new thing or how that new thing is going to end. Anyone know what this is? Yes. So it's the plastic bag. So this is a patent for the plastic bag by the industrial designer Sten Gustav Thulin. It's a patent in 1965. He worked for a Swedish company called Celloplast. It is a beautiful solution to a design problem. That is, it's very simple. He takes a roll of polyethylene, this is what the patent describes. You fold it over into a tube, you weld it, then you cut that tube into rectangular shapes, you weld that, and then you do 2 cuts for arms, and you have a plastic bag made cheaply, inexpensively. You can distribute it. It's the design, it's the answer to the design problem of convenience. So many ways when we look at this kind of elegance, this is what we think about with the design problem. But you really think about it is, what are all the things we had to exclude to make this design problem solvable? And what, in fact, did we solve in biography terms? This is an image from Pacific Garbage Patch, which we know the life, the biography of Sten Gustav Thulin and the plastic bag. We know now, even though it has been legislated out of so many places in global north, not so much the global south, it is still ongoing. The plastics themselves, at best, will reduce to microplastics after maybe 100 years. And they continue in all of our streams, rivers, land. I mean, they've been found in the lungs of humans and non-humans. I mean, they're in our bodies. It's ongoing biography. The life force at work, what it's inscribed in the world, and what it leaves behind. You can think about that with technology, that very ubiquity. Well, let's design that app, and that app has location tracking because location tracking is so convenient. I can turn on my app and I don't have to worry about what city I'm in, it'll tell me. But yet we know the world that the biography of all of these apps, that what we cohabit, this world of surveillance capitalism. This image is from the New York Times, where they bought 3 months of data, of location data for 1.2 million users. They could track everybody just based on public information of their place of work and their place of home. And depending on what apps you have on your phone, your location was tracked every 7 to 21 seconds. That's the full biography of the things that we design, the things that we exclude from the design problem of, again, in this particular case, mobility. So in actually my book, I don't call these biographies, I call these anti-biographies, in the sense that they're anti-life. So in trying to think about, well, how do we put these into more than human terms? So just 2 examples. One is, so I was actually asked to write a book chapter in this book on smart cities and more than human worlds. And my chapter was on the future of cities. And I thought the best way to understand the future of cities was to understand the endings of the biographies that inhabit cities. If we trace what their endings are, we trace where the things are that we've designed in the world will end. And we think about their endings. And it really is a plea in some sense to think as designers, not just to think about the newness of what we're designing, but to think about how what you are going to design is going to end. And in some sense, to work back from there. In our case, in our Turner boxes, we're experimenting with the forms, whether it be terracotta or plaster Paris. What is it going to be left behind? And thinking about the design that's actually on a pole now, but at the end it will fall and it will become a place to dwell for cavity dwelling bees. Most bees actually nest in the ground, not in hives. The last concept I want to share is this idea of constituency. So I talked about gatherings and the things that we gather, but I really think that it's actually that much of these politics that we get involved in, the understanding that the things we make are politics, that much of these politics are decided ahead of time. They're decided by the very things that you gather before you even design. But let me give you an example of a kind of human, non-human constituency and how it shapes what the outcomes are. So the metaphor I like to use is a kitchen. So if you think about a kitchen, it's a gathering. It's a gathering of non-human things, ingredients, foodstuff, materials, technologies, the cooking technologies, the pots and the pans, It's a collection of people who wants to gather in that particular kitchen. It's a collection of knowledge, whether again the people or the cookbooks and the recipes that are part of that. It's also a place of politics. It's where we decide what cultures we're going to replicate. Also, whether we're going to have a GMO kitchen or a vegan kitchen or a vegetarian kitchen. All of these values and matters of ideas around a kitchen are sorted out before we cook, before we think about who's going to cook. Whatever we cook is going to be the outcome of the gathering of the kitchen. And it's the same with design. If we think about the values, and we think about the politics, and we think about what we want to gather and the importance of those gatherings before we even begin design. And the beautiful thing about a kitchen and cooking is that there's no one way to have a kitchen. Going back to David Abrams, kitchens are of place. They're of ethnicity, they're of history, they're of culture. Anyone who tells you there's one way to design is just simply doing us a disservice. There are a multiplicity of ways of design that recognize all the various differences, and this is true. They can't think of something that's actually more fundamental and basic to us as eating and cooking. But we already have these constituencies in some form. The very studios, this place is a constituency. IAAC is a constituency. The very choices you make of what can be done in here are in many cases already made for you. Rethinking, which I'm sure happens all the time, the gathering, what should be here, what shouldn't be here, what should be included, what should be excluded, is really about the values and the ethics and the culture of this place, and that will determine the politics and the more than humanness of the things that we make. The example I use in the book is what's known as the Life Patch Collective, which is a DIY bio group in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. They're a group of biologists, of artists, of designers. They all live in around the Yogyakarta River. The Yogyakarta River is the focus of their design, of their DIY bio work. This is the constituency that gathers. It includes the bacteria in the river, it includes the water in the river, it includes the animal life in the river. It also extends, in their collective, they include their parents, they include their mothers, they include the village that they came from, this sort of extension, this expansiveness of what that constituency is that informs not only who they are, but their values and their politics and what is important and how they want to thrive, their cohabit in not only their familial life, but also in their more than human life. But constituencies are also things that need to be undone sometimes. So one of the things that we've learned, and we're trying to do, I'm just going to end and return to my bee project, is that our focus is actually on mason bees and bumblebees. But when we think about bees, we think about honeybees, in part because honeybees have this kind of human-centered, they're domesticated. If you look at the most science around bees, and is all focused on honeybees because they're things that we can actually manipulate and bring into our lab, and we can cultivate and we can raise. If you think about all the politics in Vancouver, for example, you can have a beehive. It's worked in, it's legislated, you can have a beehive in your backyard. If you think about all of the groupings and constituencies and knowledge and gathering, it's all about honeybees. And then of course, there's all industrial agricultural production, which is behind that. So when you want to understand bees that are not honeybees, you're obscured by that constituency. So I think there's a real need to focus on this kind of collective structures and assumptions and constituencies that inform our design and shape the politics of them, and to rethink those anew as well. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions or comments.
Well, thank you very much for the conference. It's been very inspiring, especially I would say for the MDiv students still, the ones that were the most. Look, very quickly, about the way you talk, the things you said, for me, they have a lot to do in how as designers, we need to unlearn to actually be able to understand this new way of design. So the same usually would easily be able to tell someone 5 things he needs to learn as a designer. Could you tell us 5 or 3 or 2 things we need to unlearn as designers to follow this approach?
Sure, great question. I think you're absolutely right. I think, and I mean, I don't know if there's no particular order. First of which is that design is not an individual pursuit. I think the very concept of the individual designer has blinded us, actually has given us all kinds of permissions to do these anti-biographies that I'm talking about. And of course, it's caught up in the structures of kind of neoliberalism and capitalism. But this idea of individual autonomy and creativity is the thing that we're taught and things that we pursue. That's what makes us a good designer. And that same individual designer, when met with the kind of real moral and ethical challenges of now, doesn't know what to do, because you can't address these ethics and challenges on your own. It's a collective pursuit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would really like us to pay much more, as I said, with constituencies, to pay much more attention to not only what we're going to design, but how we design in terms of the collective structures. That we've made all kinds of assumptions about we're either going to work, for either as a consultancy, or work in a firm, or work in a corporation. These things didn't just, these things were constructed. That the values design has been happening for millennia. And I think this idea of paying attention to and us educating the very collective structures, IAAC is one of them, but there needs to be much more multiplicity, much more creative thought into what is the collective structure by which we design, and a collective structure that supports the values that we design. So what is a collective structure that's not human-centered, that's not about human exceptionalism, but is about a more than human approach? And I think is something that designers need to pay attention to, is something that actually, as I've tried to point out, really drives design. So paying attention to the creating of the structures by which you design that align with the values that you want out of design, the very thing that motivated you to design. Third thing is an idea that I think we really have always had this notion in design about materials as being passive. As materials and the things that we design with, or tools, are doing our bidding. We reason what we think is the right thing to do, and then we shape passive materials, and we augment our great skills through the tools that we use. That, in many ways, I think needs to be rethought. That I think the ways in which the things shape what we do, and they participate in the way that I talked about, and that we need to shape not so much design from our minds, but design from our bodies, to reshape, transmogrify our relationship to the world around us. The very difference of going for a walk in the woods, lying down in the woods, rolling around in the woods, are all very different experiences and different kinds of relationships. And so I think that's the third thing that I would suggest.
Any other question?
And a bit following with what Guillem said. Oh, there is a question?
No, go ahead, Oscar. There was a question down there back.
Okay,
Yeah.
so how do you think design education needs to change?
Sorry, and I'm implicated in this because I'm a design educator. I think we do have to. I mean, it's actually a very. I understand that, there's been much good in the way in which we have designed, and in a sense, it has been a liberatory practice, and it has shaped, and there's much that has been thought through about the kind of relationships that we have with each other. And there's a lot of care that has gone into the way in which we've designed. We have, this term in design of worlding. We've constructed a world where we are constantly constructing a world. It happens to be a very particular world. It required a lot of constructions along the way, a lot of assumptions about what our role as a designer, some things that I've talked about. I wish that there was a partial way that we could rethink design education. I mean, maybe the first of which is acknowledgement that we don't exist in a human-centered world. That might be a good starting point. But ultimately, when you really get down to it, to really act in the way I think we need to with the kind of urgencies that are at stake now, there is a complete rethought and rethinking. However, I would argue that rethinking needs to be done in a pluriversal manner. It needs to be done with multiplicity. There is no one-way design. We need a kind of differences and sets of collectivity and just see what emerges. We need far more experimentation than we have. We are far too conservative in design. We actually think we're achieving something, but we're blind to all the things that we're not doing. So that's what I would say. I think a rethinking, but the way that's really done in a kind of multiplicitous way. I think there was a question back there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. And could you speak a little bit more about
the bee pollination, which you showed briefly.
Sorry, speak more about the bee pollination.
Yeah, and how you enhance the pollination happening.
Yeah. So I don't know that I necessarily, I mean, that was my, so I think your question wasn't how do I enhance pollination? More about the project, yeah. So I think that, so I think the question, so first of all, what I think that where the starting point for this question was, for this project, was the idea, understanding urban environments as, yes, technological, but multi-species. And trying to understand, like I said before, that much of my design is about trying to understand the relationships through things. So I'm really, to be really quite honest, I'm hoping that if I'm trying to understand what relationship we can have alongside pollinator ecologies, what role we have through design that we could play that is cohabiting. So not extractive, not designing for, not stewardship. I don't know what the relationship is. I'm trying to figure that out. That will reveal urban ecologies in a more than human way. That's the simplest way to put it. However, it's not very abstract. It's actually really requires particular work. What do you do with the electronics? What do you do with networking? Do you have, a wireless technologies or not? What are the effects of wireless technologies? What are the materials we have? What are the issues about, what is the actuation and how does actuation affect either the plants or the bees, et cetera? All of these things come into question. So that's really what it's about. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, from which, I like the analogy that you presented with the people that were in the mountain, in the snow, and you were describing about how they were attached to technology. And I was wondering, in the process of design, how do you actually need to take in account about the processes of construction when you are designing something, or how much you need to be involved into the construction methods? I mean, because you know that most of the methods of design, they need to be involved, or they need to be aware, like what type of material, how it is going to be constructed. So I was wondering how do you, in which way you kind of approach these methodologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are many different ways, and I think, as I said, I think that I think one needs to understand the ways in which, and I think this is a matter of construction. Construction is a relationship, is a dynamic relationship. We're shaping and it's shaping us. And anyone who's done work and you're understanding to what degree a material cooperates or doesn't cooperate with you, doesn't do what you think it'll do, it'll do something else. And I think sometimes we need to pay attention to that, not so much as failures, or not so much as it's not the right material, as maybe it is actually trying to enact its own agentic capacity that could become part of what you do. But I think also the very choice that I think I would like to see in the gathering of the, even prior to construction, or what is involved in construction, that can be materials, that can be technologies, that can be tools, and try to think through at that point, what do these things represent for yourself? Is this part of the world that you want to cohabit? But I also think that there's something about trying to pay attention to the relationships. Everything, I think sometimes when we think about something, we immediately have a relation. It's rather than pay attention to the distinct things like the bees and me, I want to pay attention to the middle part, to the relation between them. And particular choices, they could be material choices, they could be their choices of what you want to participate in the thing that you're designing, have a particular relation. They shape things in a particular way. All those things that you saw of those alpinists, those climbers up at the top of Everest, were all shaped around a particular relationship of what it would do, how it would allow a human to climb above 8,000 meters. That's what that but it was only that relationship. We don't know how all of that nylon, I mean, if you look at Everest, I have this weird fascination with mountain climbing. I would never climb Everest, but if you look at base camp of Everest, you look at camp 1, you look at camp 2, it is just littered with stuff. It's stuff that becomes waste, and it becomes waste because it no longer has value for climbing, but yet it's still in the world. So I think when we think about those relations, so when I think in the construction of something, it's all about a set of relations. And it's all about trying to get the thing that we're working with to participate in a way that is not simply the means alone, but is connected to the end. And that might actually mean slowing down or scaling back or simplifying, working with a kind of humility with the materials that we can kind of understand about how they might end, rather than just kind of adopting whatever because we think it addresses our creative autonomy at the moment. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my best shot.
So if you design it or with this methodology, it seems like you always have to think a lot about all these influences and how your design will influence other things and or how other beings will think about it or feel about it. How important are you in this design process or yourself? How much room do you leave for to enjoy maybe to make something that where you know that the outcome might not be something useful to other things, or is it like an egoistic way of designing then?
No, I don't think it's an egoistic way of designing. I mean, I think what I put as the value prescription behind what I call designing with is how we want to cohabit the world. So I think whatever those, now, of course, that could opens up to a lot of the downsides that I talked about, but at least then we're trying to address the issue of this is the world I want to cohabit and cohabit over a lifetime. This is why it's so important, the biography part, not just the moment, but I think understand the full dynamic of the things that we design. So there's no prescription about what the value is. It's not that we necessarily only need to design, I mean, whatever you know what that means, like what does it mean to design for things that are only good? Good is an interpretive position. I don't know what that means. So I do think partly what you're also saying is that challenge of, wow, there's so many things, so many complicated sets of relations, and how do I, as a designer, think through those things? And I think part of it is that, well, we don't necessarily need to design the same way that we've done. I think we need to design with much more caution. We need to live with the things more. We need to understand the effects of them, but we've also designed so many things. You know, we could literally, if I was a design researcher, I could not design another thing in my lifetime and simply design all the relations of all the things we've already designed. I would never get to all of them. I mean, you know, I could just study this chair for the rest of my, I mean, it wouldn't be enough for me because I like to kind of think about the real problematic of the fact that we will continue to shape the world through designing. And I do think we've always done that, and I think we always will. But I do think that we need to elaborate and be really clear about our interdependencies with that world and how we want to cohabit it. And sure, joy is a big part of that. I mean, I love, that's going back to the David Abram book. I mean, that about More Than Human Worlds is just nothing but joy, that book. You know, and anybody who has been there and it sort of understood their interdependencies with the world around them on some level, if that's not some kind of joyful experience, then I don't know what is. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Any other question?
Yeah, you guys have been amazing listeners. Yeah, happy to have, happy to answer any questions if you want to come up and just don't want to talk in public. That's fine. Yeah.
Well,
There's a
so
question, or one more question.
there's a
I guess.
question. So
Yeah.
that would be the ending talk.
Fantastic.
Hi, my question is about like design by nature is exclusionary. Like in one way or the other, we always designing to cater to either specific groups or specific species and like a time maybe to a degree. And as a designer, like how do we decide on who gets a priority and like how do we gauge that?
So, but the first part of your question was that it's evolutionary?
Exclusionary.
Sorry? Exclusionary.
Exclusionary, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really, I mean, I think that's the very question. First of all, I don't think we can do inclusionary design. We can't design for everyone and everything. It's simply not possible. And I think, you know, exclusion is part of it, and privileging and prioritizing is part of it. But my point is that we are currently doing this by omission. That is, we're not even thinking about it. We're just assuming what and who is privileged. And we're not actually engaging in the active political act and negotiation about what we're going to include and what we're going to exclude. And I think that some of this is about that. And there's a kind of, and a hope that there's a kind of enlightened self-interest about what you need to include in an interdependent, more than human world. But absolutely, you're absolutely right. And I think also that part of that collective pursuit is you're never going to be of single mind. We're never going to all agree that this is what is, but that's not going to prevent us from acting. You know, and I think we can't, I mean, it's kind of the hubris of human reason that says we all have to agree first, or we all have to know everything first and do the right act before we can do anything. And that's, you know, that's analysis paralysis. That's the road to inaction.
I was quite interested by the whole talk, but it reminded the title itself reminded me of a Friends episode in which Joey says that there is no selfless deed, and from the question that he asked, it brought me to the fact that, as you spoke about, that there will be exclusion and there will be inclusion. It comes back to the honeybee kind of theory that whatever we kind of include comes from a human-centered approach. In a way, in some weird way, it comes to that. So that I just wanted to know, would you like to elaborate on this thought, I guess?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that I'm with you. I'm not hoping for a sudden transformation of selfless humans, because it's not going to happen. And selflessness is actually not a space we can occupy. It's a virtue. It's an ideal that doesn't exist. And I think we have to operate in the world in which we exist. But I would say that I think part of what is this notion that we've always been human-centered is just completely wrong. We haven't been. We've created, this is a construction. This is not how we've always been part of the world that we're in. There are many different examples. I mean, part of it, another part of this talk and in my book, I spent a lot of time talking about humanism and the Age of Enlightenment and this real effort, this ongoing over centuries construction of what ultimately is a world of human exceptionalism that has not always been. Much of the things that we take for granted as the assumptions that this is the way things are is not true. And so in that sense, there is the very capacity to kind of rethink. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's another problem to rely on the virtue of being a selfless human. And that's that very construction. What's in it for me versus I need to inhabit a world that there's nothing in it for me is a false construction. So I do think that's part of it. I think design in some ways is kind of like just, I mean, if I really, well, I mean, design is very much an elaborate set of constructions that are not just, I mean, this is what we do. It's systematic. It's the material arrangements we make, but we can rearrange those material arrangements. Yeah. So that's my point. I don't think that we, you know, and not that it's going to happen, but now we're actually in a moment in which we are challenged to address this much more quickly, much more urgently. You know, I mean, I think that I mean, we can debate 1.5 degrees Celsius, but the very most effects of the idea of climate change and what is now around the, you know, age of the Anthropocene happened well before we even realized it was a thing. You know, and so in a sense, that kind of urgency to rethink might be something that we're really in the midst of and that we can't afford the very constructions that we've constructed in.